Awesome. Going to get started. So first off, thank you very much for having me at CypherCon. It's my first time here, first time in the city, and first time in the state, and it has been lovely, even with the rain and snow. So thank you very much for a warm welcome. Really appreciate being able to hang out the last couple days. Do B-sides, MKE was awesome as well. Meet all the speakers, meet the organizers. It's just been a great time. So I really appreciate the hospitality. Test, test, test. Okay, it was a little bit low there. May have to eat the mic on this. Just saying, appreciate the warm hospitality. It's been a wonderful time. It's my first time here in Milwaukee, first time here in Wisconsin. So I don't know how I managed to make it to my old age with that being true, but it's no longer true. So I'm very happy about that. So the talk today is really about vuln management and more about vuln mismanagement. Just for kind of background, I've been putting around with something related to either scanning or writing exploit tools since like 1997. Back when it was like gross Perl scripts and Visual Basic, and that eventually turned into what I worked on for 15 years, which is Metasploit. And then between those was working on various products, doing consulting, doing pen test work, and then building products again. So this is a long old man rant, basically, but hopefully there's some useful parts here. And the end goal is for you to say, wow, my vuln management sucks, let's make it better. Because that's how I feel about the state of the world today. So I mentioned before, name's H.T. Moore, CEO, co-founder of runZero, previously ran Metasploit forever, recovering pen tester. I still like doing gigs here and there when I can, just because it's always fun to go see what the world still looks like out there. These days, I mostly get my visibility by working with customers and seeing what they're struggling with, which is a great way to get there. You can find me on email, runZero, Mastodon is HTM, infosec, or htm.io. So feel free to reach out afterwards if you have any questions on stuff, or you just want to tell me it was stupid, that's cool too. Feedback's always great. So what I'm talking about today is first, like, where are we today? What do we consider vuln management? What's the state of the world? Like, you probably already know a lot of the stuff if you spend all your day doing this, but it may be a little bit old hat. But I think there's at least some surprising parts that have come out of this. Then I want to talk about like how did vuln management become enterprise software? Because it's one thing to have like a set of hacker tools that help you find vulnerabilities, and another thing to managing it like some day job, right? It's a very big gap. How did we get there? What does it look like? What happened? I want to talk a little bit about what the near future looks like. As we're seeing the tooling, the market, the industry, everything kind of evolving the last few years, what's it going to look like this year, next year, and so on? And then how do we make that better? What do we do that's actually a better outcome than where we're going today by default? Anyone here ever used a CyberCop? It used to be called Ballista back in the day. One of the really early commercial vulnerability scanners. Anyone else used ISS's scanner back then, Internet Security Systems, before Real Secure and Black Ice, but they had a vuln scanner back then too. There were very few products back then that were like commercial vuln scanners. Something that's really cool is that the old CyberCop scanner actually had like a 3D city view. You could fly through space to like see all your hosts and vulnerabilities, and we've never gotten back to that peak. We're still striving to get better, flying through city space hacker views of vuln management. We never got back there. So this is what the vuln management tools looked like in 1999. On the left side, I think left side's ISS. Right side, I believe, is CyberCop. And you've got some charts. You say, number of vulnerabilities by severity, percent of vulnerabilities by severity, a list of operating systems. And you can tell these are old because the OSs here are things like HP Unix, Baytech, all the old crunchy stuff like NT351, all the fun things we used to shell all day long back then. What's actually interesting though is the variety of operating systems is pretty unique. You don't see this variety anymore. Now you got 3. You used to have like 35. It was amazing. Hackers could do a little bit of everything and still own everything. Now you have to get really good at least one of them to really keep up. So it's been 25 years. What do vulnerability management products look like in 2024 as of like last night? Number of vulnerabilities by severity. Again, I don't want to like get sued by any vuln management vendors, but we haven't gone very far. We're presenting the same data the same way in the same charts. We're almost using the same libraries. We're using the same representation, the same everything. Like these are actually modern products you can buy for lots and lots of money right now. And there's only 3 big vendors these days. Why do the products look the same as they did in 1999? So that's kind of what I want to dig into a little bit here is like, how come things haven't changed? Why does everything look so dated and crunchy? And like, where are we going? So you talk about vuln management, you're usually talking about 4 parts of a life cycle. You start off saying, hey, go find some stuff I need to care about, whether it's missing patches, configuration problems, unknown asset, whatever happens to be, go find the thing that I care about. Prioritize it to the things that I think are most important because I can't do everything. Try to remediate it. Try to like either open a ticket, make someone else remediate it. I love it when people talk about opening tickets as remediation. It's like, you're not remediating it. The poor sucker on the other end of the ticket, they're remediating it. And then you're coming back trying to verify it and say, yes, you actually did a good job remediating it. But it's hilarious when you talk to vuln management vendors and they say, we have remediation in the product. I'm like, so you create a ticket to make someone else do it? Like, yes, okay. Is that remediation, or that's just making it someone else's problem? So the challenge of this cycle is that every step through this path gets more difficult. For every 1,000 vulnerabilities you look at that you identify, you maybe fix one of them and validate one of them. Like it's just a really tight funnel. You're not really going to get to the validation stage of most things that you ask your team to go look into. It's a lot of work. So we've really been focusing our time not on identification anymore. Like we don't necessarily care how good the identification is because we can't keep up in the first place. We've really been focusing our time on prioritization and then trying to figure out how to make remediation faster and validation faster. But if you look at kind of where most of the investments go into vulnerability management today, we're really focused on prioritization, which is kind of a weird thing to work on. Like, why would you want to take a big list of things that a tool will give you and then throw most of them away? And that's effectively what we're doing by highlighting, by focusing on prioritization. So we know it's difficult, we know it's problematic. Like this is why we're here, is because this is the challenge. This is why I'm talking about it. Just kind of make that clear. Like you almost never get to the validation phase for most of the vulnerabilities you find. So what are we doing with them? Well, then a team gets asked, well, how are you performing as a vulnerability management team? Like, your pointy-haired bosses come by and they say, well, why are we spending this much money on the tooling and on this team, these things, if we're only fixing this microscopic percentage of total vulnerabilities? Well, then you have to go back and say, well, here's our time to detect, or time to remediate, or time to verify. Here's the absolute vuln counts. Here's our absolute risk score. Here's our adjusted risk score model through this particular algorithm. Here's the prioritization view from this other product that sits on top of my first product. Here's my coverage ratio of assets. Here's the number of exceptions, reopens. Like we come up with all these like funky metrics to talk about how well the program's performing because we can't show what we want to show, which is we have no more vulnerabilities. We just aren't going to get there, and we've decided we're not going to get there. So instead, we have to try to demonstrate all these other metrics and kind of somewhat numerology around it, saying here's things that mean that show that we're doing good work. Now that's the boss's view. Like personally, if you're on a vulnerability management team, like you're busting your butt. You're trying to make sure that you don't get hacked. You're doing everything you possibly can to work hard. But how do you show that, right? And that's really been the challenge for a lot of teams, is how do you show that in a way that actually makes a difference to whether you get owned or not? So if you look at like the scan and patch cycle, kind of your standard vulnerability management vuln scanner cycle, it really fell apart in 2005. And if you look at this chart on the bottom, this is the number of CVEs by year, and you get a sense for why it fell apart. We had this like, decent number of kind of consistent number of vulnerabilities going through kind of mid 2000s. Then you get to 2005 and it almost triples. Then you get to I think it's like 2019 here, and it's almost 10 times what it was before. We had something like 20,000 CVEs reported last year. And a lot of folks are aware that MVD is now kind of struggling to keep up with all of it, and they haven't even like looked at or triaged any of these vulnerabilities. They're like way, way, way behind at this point. And now you know why, because there's so many CVEs being created. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing really depends on how credible you think CV is in the first place. How many vulnerabilities don't have a CV in the first place? Like we're now seeing alternate sources of vulnerability tracking, things like the GitHub database, the advisor database, that have absolutely nothing to do with CVE. They're just putting a unique identifier on some new badness that you can track. So CVE is not even the whole story, and it's already spiraling out of our control and our ability to keep up. So if you look at how we've been doing, scan and patch, like as we started to roll out things like Windows XP SP3, which is a big change, every endpoint started having a firewall enabled by default. Well, now you can no longer connect to WMI. Now you can't connect to SMB. You can't do authenticated scans of these devices because you can't talk to them anymore. There's no port to go query to see whether it has a patch installed. So all the scan and patch stuff really started to hit a wall around 2005, and that's when things started to break down. And of course, you have your segmentation, your cloud, your BYD, all these other things that make it more difficult to just like point a scanner at your network and tell it to go find badness. Similarly, the amount of work that goes into writing an unauthenticated vulnerability check is equivalent to writing a fully working exploit. And I say that like I've done both, and they're just as difficult, if not harder, to write the vuln check. Like you're working on a really tricky heap exploit, you have to massage the heap and do a thing and flip some bits and do all that kind of stuff, prepare it all, and then you finally get a shell maybe. Like a vuln check is harder, because you have to do the exact same thing but not crash the process, and you have to leak it back in a certain way, and you have to cover future compatibility and previous compatibility and every possible thing under the sun. And the hardest thing about vuln checks is that it's not just you and the target you're talking to, you're also talking to everything else between you and the target. So you're often going through a firewall, a WAF, a proxy, some other kind of defensive tooling, and those things have bugs and they fall over. Like one of my favorite vulnerabilities of all time, which is probably a friend of mine's least favorite vulnerability because it was in his product, was the Realize UDP Stack Overflow back in like 2006, something like that. Like if this device was designed to, Realize eventually Black Ice eventually got acquired by ISS, which became Real Secure. But if this device saw a packet coming across the wire that triggered the vulnerability, it would then shell your IDS. So now your IDS is controlled by the attacker, and it didn't matter where the packet came from. You could spray it across the network, and as long as your IDS saw it someplace, you got in. So that's one of the examples of where unrelated products are impacted by doing vulnerability scanning or other types of network work. So all this kind of came together, and we started saying authenticated scans really are the standard. Like you can no longer do unauthenticated scans because you can't afford to write an unauth check for anything. It just takes too much research time. We've seen teams that used to be, either 75-25 research to patch to basically authenticated local checks turn to really 25-75 the other way. Where there's a very small team doing unauthenticated vuln check work now. It's really just a bigger team keeping with patch management. We'll go into more detail here on that, but some of these vendors are now shipping over 100,000 checks in their product. Like that's a lot of checks, and you can't stop checking for something. If you're a vuln management product, you can never get away with not checking for an NT351 vulnerability or an IRX default account. Like that may be 30 years old, but you still have it in your product. You're constantly just accreting stuff on top of your product. You're creating more work. You're adding more load to the network. You're adding more checks. There's ways you can kind of slice and dice that and get rid of some of that stuff, but you can never really get rid of all of it. Especially if like it's a web server. Let's say it's a web server you don't know anything about and you're running a vuln scan against it. Like, what do you check on it? Do you check everything? Do you check hundreds of thousands of requests against it to find every possible web app that could be running on it under every particular subpath? Or you just say, hey, it's running Apache. And that's actually a checkbox in a lot of vuln scanning products because it massively increases the amount of time and resources it takes to finish the job. So that's kind of the challenges we're looking at going forward is that you have to always check for all the old stuff. You can't just drop that. You have to be perfect every time. You don't have a pre-auth vuln check team that's particularly big anymore because they're so hard to write and so difficult. It's kind of a lost art in a lot of ways. So what have we done instead? Well, I moved to agents. So most vuln management vendors now have an agent. The agent's now responsible for doing all that hard work, but on the device. So you don't have to jump through firewall hoops. You don't have to go figure out, is it reachable? Is it pre-auth? You just say, is the check installed or not? And there's still problems with that. Like some of these agent-based checks, they say, great, we installed the patch, you're good. And then of course the question was like, well, did you reboot? If not, well, that bug's still there, right? You have to actually reboot the device to, especially for like the SMB2 vulnerabilities, like the internal blue, stuff like that. Unless you actually rebooted the box, the patch didn't actually apply. So folks would say, hey, great, my agent says we're applied everywhere, but it didn't really matter because the machine hasn't been rebooted in 2 years. Back in the early days of the internet, Unix admins would flex about their uptime. So someone would say, my machine hasn't been rebooted in like 5 years. I'm like, congrats, how many vulnerabilities do you have in your kernel right now? Like, we got a little bit better at that with some of the live kernel patching stuff, but it's not great. Like generally, the longer your machine's been online, probably the least it's been updated. So I'd actually look at uptime as like a negative indicator for vulnerabilities these days in that sense. So the challenges with agent-based vulnerability reporting is that you don't have the network context anymore. You don't know whether an attacker can actually reach that thing. You just know that it's present. So if you're looking for something like, okay, I found a log4j, I found the Java log4j jar file on disk, and I know it's out of date. Great, what does it actually mean? Is it exposed to the network? Is it part of a web app? Is it just sitting there, but it's part of some GUI thick client that doesn't go anywhere? Like you have no context anymore for whether that thing's actually exploitable. So you lose a lot of the valuable insight into the risk and the exposure. So it's really difficult to prioritize vulnerabilities when they're found through an agent-based scan because you don't know whether they're reachable. You don't know what their impact is anymore. You just know that the CVE is there. So if you look at some of the EDR products that have now been shipping vuln management data, they just give you a giant list of CVEs. It's like, well, what am I gonna do with that? Like, which ones matter? Why should I care about it? Like, give me more context. I need more to make a decision about it. Anyway, so the challenges. So if you look at the breakdown of vulnerability checks by category for a couple of the major products, right? I don't want to pick any particular vendor or get sued, but here's an example of one particular vendor. Local checks are the blue, and everything else is basically Windows checks, Cisco, web, miscellaneous. The pre-authenticated checks there are probably less than 1% of that pie. That's just the relative ratios. Now, taking a different approach on it, let's look at a different vendor and say, how many of your checks every year have been remote unauthenticated checks that I could just throw at the network and say, is it unauthenticated or not? Well, that bright purple line, that's the percentage of unauth checks in 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, and then you see it collapse around 2005. The percentage of checks they write that are pre-authenticated, they just gave up, said, nope, we're just doing local checks from now on. Like, we're gonna do a really, really small number. And that number keeps getting smaller as a percentage of the whole. So let's flip around and then look at that as the absolute numbers. So the absolute numbers are actually not that different. So you can see that, hey, in 1999, we had something like, 300 or 400 vuln checks. 2002, we had about 700. As we got down to 2023, we still have about 700 pre-auth vuln checks. But look at how many other checks are out there. And these are almost all Unix authenticated checks. These are ones that, like, every time there's a vulnerability in some Linux platform, they then duplicate that vulnerability check for every OS and distribution. So you have your Fedora version, you have your Red Hat version, your RHEL version, you'll have your Ubuntu version, your Debian version, and so on. So it ends up padding the numbers quite a bit. So when vendors tell you that they've got 200,000 vuln checks, what they're really telling you is they write about 300 or 400 pre-auth checks per year. So vulnerability management is now falling behind quite a bit. Like, not only are you struggling to figure out what to prioritize, but it's really difficult to get things fixed, to get validated, and so on. You're also not really getting good data in the first place. A lot of these checks are just not checking the thing that you actually care about that second. Oftentimes because the vulnerabilities are being exploited faster than you can scan them, and faster than the vendor can even push an update to go scan them. So, great examples there, like MoveIt. Like, it's a product that most people didn't hear about until a few months ago. It's made by Progress Software. It makes lots of other exploitable stuff. And if you are waiting for your vuln scanner to give you an update to go look for a MoveIt, and then you have to wait for a scan cycle, and then run that scan cycle, and then report back up, like, you already have a ransomware notice in your email. You've already been owned. Like, it's been 2 weeks. We've seen the time between discovery of vulnerability in the wild and the response by vendors, it's stretching out to weeks and months at this point. One of the recent Avanti bugs, there was literally no patch for it for 2 weeks. Another good example was the Cisco iOS XE HTTP daemon vulnerability. This is like one of those, if you're old school and you remember the old /level15 hack in Cisco iOS, basically you just go to Cisco iOS web interface and put /level15 and you're God mode and you logged in. It was great. That happened all over again, basically, with Cisco iOS XE, the Linux-based version of with the web daemon. And by the time Cisco was able to notify everybody about it, as part of the advisory, they said, 1, we don't have a patch. 2, you've already been hit by a state actor. Here's the IOCs to look for. 3, good luck. Like, that's where we are these days. Like, our exposure is so wide, vendors are so underwater that they can't, by the time they even tell you about it, they don't necessarily even have a patch available for you at this point. They're just telling you, like, you need to start digging for incidents. You need to trigger, a response. So because the scanner is mostly authenticated patch checkers, all your unmanaged stuff is not being left behind because, of course, you can't do an agent-based or an authenticated enumeration of this random virtual appliance or whatever the junk is on the network that's not part of your managed infrastructure. So you start figuring out, okay, anything on my network that doesn't have an agent or that I can't log into, like, that's now a dark spot. That's something I don't know anything about that I'm gonna have a really big challenge getting ahead of. Sometimes those virtual appliances, and we've seen attackers, on one hand, the shift in attacks for the last probably 8 months or so has been hardening because we're no longer seeing as many phishing attempts, end user targeting stuff, because we've actually gotten pretty good with our EDRs and our agents and our firewalls and our filters and all that kind of junk. So instead, the attackers went after the next softest link, which is all the crap at the edge. So your edge firewalls, your routers, your VPT, your VPNs, your file transfer systems, all that stuff hanging out there right at the edge of the network. That's really been the juicy spot for attackers. But they have to go a lot deeper. It's a lot harder work to do. But it's just kind of fun seeing, like, the commodity of exploitation shift from internal kind of phishing attacks now to the edge again, after it went back the other direction, back and forth a few times over the last few years. So prioritization has now become its entire own market because prioritization is such the key piece of getting ahead of your vulnerability management strategy at this point. You now see products that all they do is sit on top of another product and filter out stuff and give you less garbage. Now, it blows me away that you would, like, buy a product that sits on top of another product just to give you less data from it. But that's what we got. And the truth of it is the vendors who are making those tools are also trying to catch up and make prioritization easier. But in the meantime, there's this great market selling into that anyways, saying, okay, well, they're not doing it fast enough. Here's what you need instead. All right, so how do we get from cool hacker stuff to this thing that we're dealing with today, this big pile of slow-moving authenticated agent-based vuln checks? Well, in the beginning, there were hackers, right? Lots of soft targets, almost no detection. We just all ran around hacking things left and right. It was great. No one could catch us unless you're really, really stupid or you bragged a lot. Like, as long as you didn't, brag about things too loudly online, or forget to use a proxy or something like that, you could just tear through the network back in the 90s, and no one would be the wiser. Now, if you want to hack things faster, you write a scanner for it. You say, here's the thing I want to break into. Here's a cool technique I have, whether it's like a WCFTP INI file, like, download where you can steal everyone's passwords, or all those other cool techniques back in the day, PHF attack, all that stuff, the SendMail whiz stuff early on in the in the world. Scanners for those things made intrusions really quick, really easy, and really fast. So it got to the point that there are so many hackers hacking all the stuff that they, businesses started to say, hey, this sucks. Let's not make this happen anymore. How do we keep people out of our systems? This is getting messy, and our vendors aren't really caring and responding quick enough. So they hired consultants. They said, great, we're gonna hire consultants to come in and do an assessment, find the bad stuff, and then keep hackers out by telling us what to go lock down and make sure it doesn't happen again. So the hackers said, great, we're gonna be consultants. So that's how I got in this industry. I was a internet hoodlum in my teens, and decided, like, wow, these customers are really struggling with this thing that I write all day. Let's go be a consultant. Consultants then built tools which are not that different from the original scanners. There's still things to make their lives easier to quickly find vulnerabilities and exposure. Those tools eventually evolved into a product of some sort, and those products then became these big platforms where there's multiple parts to it. So if you look at the maturation, if you will, Like what we're selling in the vuln management world is typically a hacker's view of the organization delivered as some sort of software, whether it's SaaS or on-prem or some combination. You really want to show someone like, here's the juicy spot in your network that you need to go fix now. That's generally the goal. How do you prioritize remediation of the thing that someone's going to take advantage of, the most likely to take advantage of for your particular environment? But customers need more than a vuln scanner. They don't want to be given just one giant list of problems to go fix, right? They also want to be able to show their boss that they're doing lots of work and show trends over time. So now you've seen that the original vuln scan model has been kind of warped a little bit, and now folks are having to say, well, we need dashboards, we need reporting, we need lifecycle management, we need a remediation button that bothers the IT people each time I want them to go fix something. And the competition really kind of started heating up because there's a lot of money in this. It became kind of a big industry. Back around 2005 or so, there's probably almost like 7 or 8 really big players in vuln management, all kind of fighting it out. Of course, your Rap7s, your Tenables, you had your Encircle, quite a other names that kind of got lost to the history books or acquired multiple times since then. These days, there's about 3, right? There's only about 3 big vendors left. And there's other folks trying to come back into the market and join it, but they're a little bit different. They're not really the same type of product. So there's so much money tied to vuln management that folks really started competing not just on how good they were at detecting stuff, but all the other features, all the dashboarding, all the other junk you could do, how great it makes your team look, how all the other features that are tied to it, but not necessarily about doing a good job of vuln management itself. So what also made it worse is that the regulatory environment really pushed for commoditization. They stopped caring whether your vuln data was good. They just cared that you did it and then you did certain things with it. They said, okay, well, if you find a high or critical vulnerability in your PCI environment, thou must remediate within this period of time. But they don't care what tool you use for it. They don't care how accurate that tool is. They don't care whether that tool is actually correct and whether it's reporting as a high or a critical. Like the value has gone away. Like instead they're just saying you must do this thing, but we don't really care how. So vuln management alone wasn't really enough for other folks. Like you couldn't really make money in vuln management alone once you got to a certain size because like there's only a certain number of customers that want this stuff, and the quantification of vuln scanners meant that customers didn't really care anymore if they're good anymore, just that you had one. And so it really sucked the life out of like being able to build good products to find exposures because people weren't being paid for it anymore. You're getting paid for doing this other stuff. We're also deploying, a EDR agent, for deploying UBA, like user behavior analysis stuff. Like you've watched these vendors who came in from the pure vuln management side now shift gears to cover everything else in the security spectrum. Like we've now seen EDR companies ship vuln management. We've seen vuln management companies now ship EDRs. Like it's getting all kind of topsy-turvy these days. In the meantime, like the scanners had to keep adding more checks. Again, you never get to stop checking for something. You have to always keep adding more stuff. So these things just got bigger and heavier and slower because you had to keep adding more things on top of it. But the growth behind the business wasn't there to really innovate and make it faster and better. So the innovation really kind of stalled. So one regulatory regime I like to look at a lot is PCI, just because they tend to kind of point where the rest of the industry is going to go, especially for general commercial. If you look at, so PCI has a few requirements, and they just changed recently again with DSS 4 that is now mandatory as of like 2 days ago, I think. But one thing you'll notice is they have really 2 components to vuln scanning. They've got your external scan that has to be done quarterly and an internal scan that has to be done quarterly. On the external scan side, they say you must use an ASV, an approved scanning vendor. The approved scanning vendors used to be in the hundreds, like 200, 300 vendors. There's about 77 right now. Like that number has been whittled down over time. There's actually a much smaller number of vendors involved as ASVs these days than there used to be. And if you look at some of these names on the right side, like how many of these companies actually build a vuln scanning product? How many are just services that package somebody else's stuff? It's a pretty small number of the companies there, these websites that actually build a vuln scanner. The rest are effectively just packaging it multiple products, pointing at you and delivering it like a service. So the number of unique vuln scanners out there is probably around 4 or 5 right now. It's actually a pretty small number across the board, even with these 77 ASVs. Now what's different though is that on the internal side, PCI DSS says you must do a quarterly internal scan. You need to mitigate all critical and high severity vulnerabilities, but there's absolutely no requirement about what tool you use. So you need to download and use either an open source tool, literally purchase product A or product B because those are the only 2 products that are ASV certified, or use your ASV for internal scans as well, through sort of like, on-prem proxy, things like that. But there's absolutely no requirement about how good those tools are. Like whether external ASVs at least have to meet some sort of like certification criteria and get tested to be part of the program. There's no such criteria internally. You can literally write a shell script that says good, bad, and run on your network, and you've now been, you're qualified for PCI internal scans. It's terrible. So that's the challenge. It's like in a market where there is no value for having a good product for internal assessments, like who's going to go build those tools if you can't sell it? There's no money to be made. There's no requirement. There's no hard edge there. So instead, all you get are folks who really care about security, who are trying to find a product and then struggling to find something that's actually accurate and good because there's no market, reward for it. And that's really what's led us to where we are today. So if you look at kind of where things are going right now, it's not great. We're seeing kind of a big shift between vulnerability management and attack surface management, all the different variants of that, like CAASM, EASM, you name it. And they're doing very different things for different reasons, but they're about to collide. And that's kind of what this next section is about. It's talking about kind of what the near term looks like between ASM and CAASM and vulnerability management. So, it's not security unless you put the word cyber in front of it, unfortunately. I still kind of grimace because cyber still means something very different to me. Growing up in the 90s, it's been killing me having to use the word cyber at work. So vulnerability management is not preventing incidents, and I think everyone knows why, right? You're getting a ton of data, you're having to prioritize it, you're only able to fix a small portion of it, and the cycle is so slow to get an update to scan before you can mitigate it that it doesn't really matter. It's not really relevant anymore to preventing a breach. It's just there to show that you're doing the basics in the background and kind of keeping a lid on things. But security response has to be faster than ever. Like, you have negative time now from when you hear about a vulnerability to when you're gonna get a ransomware letter, or you're gonna have someone in your network or extorting your customers. Like, the timelines have gone negative across the board, especially in the last 8 months or so. It's been pretty brutal for everybody. I think there's a talk later today about what is it, like a hot exploit summer or hot 0-day summer. Like, hot 0-day summer is stretched all the way into the spring again, guys. Like, we haven't slowed down anytime soon, and we're not about to. So while all this has kind of been simmering in the background, there's a thing called CAASM that Gartner being the analyst group, has decided to call it CAASM, which is Cyber Attack Asset Service Management. They're focused on enabling security and IT teams to find all your stuff and then basically mitigate vulnerabilities, continuously monitor, and so on and so on. So the idea is that instead of like just doing vulnerability management, like finding vulnerabilities, putting them onto the factory floor, and then going through all the various conveyor belts of your internal org to get them fixed, instead we want to say, let's look at everything. Let's pick the things that are most relevant for your exposure right now, and let's focus on monitoring and reducing that exposure as quickly as we can. So it's more of like a practical approach, if you will. Like, you're never going to fix all your vulns, but you need to know what you have, and you need to know what people are about to exploit before they exploit them. And it's much more of like a practical, kind of faster approach to this. But the key building block behind any of these CAASM, ASM, EASM, whatever products is knowing what we have in the first place. So you've probably been bludgeoned to death with marketing around asset inventory and things like that for the last couple of years. This is why, is that you can't really deliver on any of these promises unless you know about all your stuff. And finding all your stuff is hard. It's not just hard to find it externally, it's hard to find it internally and everywhere else. There's lots of stuff just kind of hiding on the corners of your network. So my current job, I started this company when I was doing pen test work. I left Rapid7 after the IPO, went in and spent some time back on the field again, helping startups, but also went back into pen test worked for Traders Partners for a couple of years, or 3 years, almost 4 years. And we went into various like banks and retail and things like that and just hacked everything all day long, and it was great. Also lots of IoT and tearing apart hardware and things like that. So really fun job. One thing we noticed though is every org, especially when you're going to the same merchant bank every single quarter, and every single quarter you're doing the same test and you're getting in again, but you have to get in again through a totally different way because the team is really trying to keep you out again. They're basically closing every door you find. So if you're doing this for like 18 months with the same customer and you're coming back in for like another pen test in the same org so well, it's like, what's left? Like, we know everything about your environment. We've already gone from here to here. We know where their servers lives. Your structure, your monitoring, everything about it. You have to get really creative. So we found all kinds of funny ways to kind of bypass that stuff. Like, what we ended up doing in the middle of that cycle was taking over the security controls. So we found like a SolarWinds block that's multi-homed inside the network that was combining the connector to the CDE and the non-CDE. And of course they did that because licensing is expensive. You don't want to have 2 servers. So you have a box sitting between the 2 of them. So we basically popped that one machine, used the SMTP clear text credential that we sniffed off the wire from one of the machines. As you heard about SMTP and Enter ID, like, it's still a thing. So we used that credential basically to get into another machine as a local user, did all the fun escalation stuff, and basically used that to take over all the infrastructure equipment. So even though we didn't have access to the CDE hardware, we didn't break into a particular CDE device at that point, we were able to just cut holes in the firewall outside and let ourselves in. So at that point, we're just like pushing configurations out to the firewalls and opening doors for our own IPs, going directly into the CDE that way. So attackers are going to find any way in, including rerouting your infrastructure, like changing your firewalls, backdooring everything you have around your systems. The great thing about tools like SolarWinds or Ryan 2, not only are they juicy targets running on Windows, but they contain all of your credentials for all your other gear. So you pop that one box, you now have passwords for all your other stuff, which is great from attacker side. Similarly, though, you fast forward another 6 or 8 months, we're starting to pull our hair out again. Like, okay, we've nothing left. Okay, they moved the SolarWinds box off. They locked these things down. We can't talk to any management interfaces. The segmentation is amazing. Then we started scanning like subnets they didn't even know they had. We basically started looking for like random 10x networks. We basically did a full RFC 1918 scan. Let's go cover every possible privately routable IP range within this within this point of the presence in the environment that we had access to. And we started finding all kinds of other crap they didn't realize they had, like building access controls, like the thing to actually open and close the doors downstairs in the building, like the access box. That was great. You'd find like weird DSL routers hanging up in like the telecom closet that was part of anyone's network map. You'd find VLANs that they didn't even realize were there anymore. You also find cases where VLANs overlap with each other, where you had like a secure network and a non-secure network, but they're actually sharing the same physical media. All you need is to sniff the network and realize you got a different VLAN coming across the same wire because they misconfigured a switch someplace. So all that stuff became kind of the next step for our kind of pen test of this type of org, where they're already particularly hardened and they're already they've been trying very hard to keep this out for many years. And that's really where the genesis for what I work on now came from. Is like, wow, people need to go find their stuff, and that's really what CAASM is about: is going and finding your stuff in the first place, and then using that new data to get you there. End of the day, if you're a customer or you're a company that really cares about your security, like if you know about it, hopefully you've got a good handle on it. So what's really going to bite you is the stuff you don't know about, and that's where I think the industry is now refocused, is helping you find all that stuff. So the typical model for CAASM products, or CAASM, tools, products, whatever combination you want to call, is that what they do is they connect to all your existing data sources with credentials. And they say, let's go talk to your DHCP server, your DNS server, your cloud backend, your Entra ID background, et cetera. Let's take all the data, glue it all together and say, let's mush all the assets together and match them up and say, now here's your stuff. So there's lots of vendors that do this. Some do it better than others. But the challenge is that each of these data sources has a very different view of the same asset. Sometimes, like, I'll call one product out. CrowdStrike loves to tell you an IP address and a MAC address that has nothing to do with what's on the network. So it'll just, the default MAC and IP it gives you is not one that's typically the one that's present on the network. It may give you a random Wi-Fi MAC, it may give you a random virtual MAC. I've seen cases where CrowdStrike data came in and we had 3 assets reported to us as online at the same time, having the same IP and the same MAC on the same network. It's like, 2 of y'all are lying. Like, I don't know who it is, but 2 of y'all are lying. And so there's lots of reasons that can happen. Like, you can have double deployments, you can have VDI, you can have all these stuff. So I'm not saying, like, I'm picking on CrowdStrike because they're a good example for this particular case, but every product has challenges. Every product has duplicates, has gaps in their coverage. So you start trying to pull data in from all these different third parties. You say, okay, is it the same asset? Is it a different asset? Has it changed? Has it been re-imaged? The ones that are probably hardest when you have like a school system where every time a student logs in, it re-images the machine and they get basically a unique install for their EDR, a unique ID for everything, but on the same physical hardware. Another one that throws these products off is when you have docks at all of your desktops in your business, like a bank, but everyone's moving the laptop between docks, but all the docks have their own unique MAC addresses. So if you're doing like a correlation based on MAC address, like you're attaching random MACs to random machines randomly across the entire org, and it makes no sense. If you try to correlate a MAC, it just blows it all up. So those are challenges too that happen. You also get really different details. Sometimes you get like the host name and that's it. Sometimes you get the host name and the IP address. You also get really different timelines. Like if you take a scan of your network from today, then you take your password discovery from yesterday, then you take a Entra ID or connector or CrowdStrike, some of the EDR backend from the day before, and you put them in the wrong order, what happens? Well, if you got a lot of DHCP churn or machines moving between networks, like you've now miscorrelated stuff because the timelines are all weird. So you really have to take into account like the time horizon when you're merging all this stuff together, and it's really difficult. But what's going to make this most difficult of all is that the vendors who are involved, who are providing all this data to these CAASM vendors, they don't want to be integrated. Like everyone wants to integrate, no one wants to get integrated. Like everyone wants to be your single pane of glass. So they will do all kinds of silly, shady things to prevent other third-party products from getting access to their data. We've seen vendors pushing their customers to put IP ACL controls in place so that the SaaS-based connectors of the third-party competitors can't talk to them. We've seen vendors who are significantly rate limiting connectors or connections coming from certain parts of the network, but not others. So for example, Microsoft Graph API, you'll see that they have a much lower rate limit when the connection is coming in from EC2, but much higher when it's coming from the customer's network. And we know why they're doing that, so they can break all the vendors connecting to the Graph API. But still, it's annoying. Like, folks are not playing fair right now in the field. So you're going to see a lot of fighting in that sense. We also see vendors who have like hundreds of integrations, but they still miss really important stuff. That happens because none of those integrations know about a device unless it's managed by something else, right? If you can talk to a machine that has DHCP or IPAM or DNS logs, great. What about the network? You can't do that too. So unless you're actually like actively gathering data about your environment, you're actively running scans, doing passive capture, you're putting a node everywhere, you're kind of just generally, actively discovering all your stuff. Even these CAASM products can't find a majority of your, or not a majority, but a large portion of your assets. Typically, if you look at just what's available through integrations only versus doing a live network scan, you're missing 25% of stuff doing just integrations, which is a pretty big number, especially when those are now holes in your map that you can't secure. So that's my mini rant on CAASM. It's hard. So being a vendor in this space, it's really difficult to get it right. And what we're also seeing is consolidation across the board. Every product in the world now sells you inventory as a side effect because they've got a list of stuff, right? So, oh, you want inventory? Sure, we got a list of your managed agents. We got a list of your endpoints over here. We got a list of the machines running this agent here. But they're all incomplete as a result. But these vendors are saying, well, we're close enough. We already have enough of your stuff. Let's go ahead and sell you ASM and vuln management too. Like we already got an EDR in your box. Like let's now look for vulns and say, now you can do vuln management. You can pass your, yes, I've done a vuln management scan because I have my agents everywhere. And we can then use that to give you a sense of your attack surface too. But again, it's such an incomplete view that it's really hard to rely on it. You have so many gaps right now if you're taking that approach. But now that we're seeing vuln management vendors selling EDRs and SIM vendors now selling EDR and vuln management, like it's just turning into one big mess at this point. So we're going to see a lot of consolidation across the board. Generally, everyone's going to be selling you something tied to cloud security, and everyone's going to sell your product tied to visibility. But this is what the ecosystem for security looks like right now. And this is last year. It's actually gotten a different sense. This is a company called Momentum Cyber. They do like investment banking and deal making in the cyberspace. And this is definitely in our chart, so you probably want to go look it up yourself later. But man, this just makes me cry. Like there are this many vendors in our space, and you've probably heard about a third of them if you squint and kind of look at them. And a lot of folks are in multiple categories. But even on this graph here, like if I spent 20 minutes drawing circles between things, I could probably point to like 50 acquisitions just in the last year. So the amount of roll-ups happening right now is ridiculous. Like we're seeing a huge consolidation across all the security vendors because everyone's fighting for the same dollars. The economic market's much harder. We're seeing people do layoffs and not rehiring back. Generally, everyone is struggling to pay their bills and generally grow, and they do it any way they can, which often requires acquiring other companies, spinning up different business units. And unfortunately, when that happens, you generally don't get good products. You just get much more shallow products. So all the big platforms have gotten a lot bigger. They've been using all the standard big platform tricks to undercut competitors, lock users into the platform. If you're part of, the Microsoft ecosystem, they're going to give you all the defenders for, your toaster, your defender for your whatever. They got lots of defender products. They're going to sell you all of them. If you're in AWS, they're the exact same thing. So depending on what bucket you're in, that ecosystem is going to try to sell you everything else that they have, right? They want you to buy all their stuff. This is really being driven right now by economics and kind of the hype cycle. We're kind of at the bottom of the hype cycle in a lot of categories. Economics are a lot tougher right now with the federal interest rate. So, I can rant about the economic side forever, but effectively, like when the federal interest rate goes up, that means startups are now that % less valuable per year. You have a much safer investment. If you can get 5% by doing nothing right now, that's 5% coming out of starting up more innovative companies, doing more innovative product stuff, experimental stuff. And it means, all the way down, people are investing less in the business. They'd rather keep their money in cash than actually invest in the business because you have that 5% buffer already. So long story short, anytime you see the federal interest rate rise really high, you're going to see a big cut into startup ecosystem innovation over the next few years as a result. And it just happens. It's just kind of part of the cycle. So one of the really surprising things about all this kind of roll up and buyers and private equity and merging stuff is you end up with these really surprising combinations of products. Is anyone here familiar with Progress Software and their line of products? Okay, well, a lot of folks are familiar with the vulnerabilities in these products. For example, like the Flowmon vulnerability came out 2 days ago. All of the WSFTP, all of the Move It stuff, all the WhatsApp stuff, What's Up stuff. So in these cases, these are companies that bought lots of other smaller software shops, put them all together, put them under the same banner, and they're just trying to make as much money as they can out of them, but they don't necessarily have a lot of time to make any of those individual products amazing. Like they're no longer in growth mode. They're now in kind of maintenance and juice it mode. And that's just kind of the nature of private equity after you roll ups. Avanti, same thing. Avanti has never made anything as a company. Avanti has just merged together multiple companies together and then sold those mushed together products back to you. And so you have like the Pulse Secure product, which I think used to be the NetScreen product. That's just repeatedly getting hammered as an exploitable endpoint in the network. And of course, it lives on the edge of the networks. Therefore, it's the door into your environment. And a little bit surprising here is a company called Fortra, which was also known as Help Systems before they spun out the cybersecurity division as Fortra. And they've got a pretty strange bucket of companies. Like I've started one of these companies and I competed against many of these companies in my life. Like the same company that makes Cobalt Strike is not the same company that owns Core Security and Core Impact. That also owns my first company that I started back in 2000. So it's a really bizarre mix-up where you now have like all these different unrelated security companies got put under the same banner, under the same roof. But they also, the funny part here is they actually all got merged into other things like file transfer products. So now you've got Core Impact and Cobalt Strike in the same like corporate overlord, if you will, as the Go Anywhere MFT product that just had like a 0-day, going around the internet, right? So yeah, it's kind of terrible that we've ended up with all of our assessment products under the same banner as some of the most vulnerable products you're supposed to be assessing. So as you start consolidating stuff, of course, it makes lots of wide investments, but lots of shallow investments. You're not going to see really deep products anymore. You're going to see people trying to cover every part of the map they can. Say, great, we've got these 10 pieces by our platform. You can kind of hit all these check boxes. So very much, checkbox driven acquisitions at this point. Very few vendors are trying to make their data better. No one's trying to say my vuln scanner is now more accurate, or I give you more data about assets than anyone else at this point. That's just not something that people can sell. They can't really compete that way anymore. They're really trying to give you a much broader chunk of your business. So it's really hard to specialize. It's really hard to have a pure security company anymore. Every security company is now just a software company, and under the same rules as any other software company. You have to grow at a certain rate. You have certain things you have to do, certain targets you have to meet. Vuln data is still treated as commodity. So no one cares how good your vulns are. They just care that you have them and that you do certain things with them based on what they say. And in some cases, like the internal requirement for PCI, they don't even care what the tool is, right? They just care that it calls itself a vuln scanner and you do certain things with output. And of course, everyone wants to sell you a single pane of glass, but there's so many single panes of glass, what do you do, right? So the short version of this is we can do better. This is where we are, this is where we're going, and it's not great, but we can definitely turn things around with a little bit of work. So if we want to build a better path, what do? Well, we already have lots of good data. So we have some data. It's not the best data, but we've got lots of data. We've got third parties we can pull from. We've got our EDR logs. We've got our SIMs. We've got our vuln scanners. We can mush them all together, do things with it. But end of the day, what we're trying to do is not manage vulnerabilities. We're trying to minimize attacker opportunities. So if you're familiar with like the equation of risk, right? Risk is the impact times likelihood. Well, we know what the impact is. What the impact is all of our customer data goes out the window and we get extortion or bad things happen or we get sued or all these other fun stuff. The likelihood, though, we don't really have a lot of control over. Like, it's someone else hacking our stuff. Like, unless, we saw Oliver's talk yesterday, unless you only deploy your products on certain days when everyone's on holiday, you don't control their schedule, right? They're just gonna hack you no matter what. So because we don't really control the likelihood part of the risk equation, we don't control our risk, flat out. We have no way to adjust our risk because we don't control the likelihood. All we can do is minimize opportunities for attackers to do things to our environment. And the way to do that is to make a list of all of our stuff. Like, what is our stuff? How many assets do we have? Where are they? Where do they live? What are they connected to? How are they managed? Where are the security controls? When there's a new emerging threat of some sort, whether it's another Cisco bug, another Progress software bug, how do we get ahead of it as fast as we possibly can? How do we get that thing off the internet within seconds, as opposed to waiting for an update in a scan cycle and a push and a remediation in the next meeting to come up to figure out which ones we prioritize, right? So we need to track technologies, not vulnerabilities. We don't really care anymore whether something's vulnerable or not. We care whether it has that software or that hardware or that end-of-life status. We care about knowing about the technology now. We don't care about knowing whether it's vulnerable. Because by definition, if you care about this technology this second, that means that there's probably no patch for it. It's probably being exploited right now. You don't get a chance to wait. You don't get a chance to wait for a scan cycle. You need to get that thing fixed this second. So we've moved ahead. We've kind of gone to the left a little bit and said, okay, you know what? We can't really depend on vulnerability management to keep us from getting hacked. What we can do is keep track of our entire infrastructure and our entire state. And if we see an emerging threat in one of these categories, we go find everything that can possibly apply to it, and we mitigate it then, right that second. But how do you do that, right? So that's the idea. We want to be able to kind of maintain a living model of our entire infrastructure with all the data we already have. So your baseline assumptions, like if you look at the modern world, things are basically managed or they're not managed. If it's managed, you got patch management, you got auto updates. Your managed assets will almost always have an agent these days, just because every EDR is effectively an agent. You have an EDR in almost everything you can manage. Like, in a lot of ways, you've got kind of two categories of assets in your environment. You've got hot dog and not hot dog, right? If anyone saw Silicon Valley, there's only two things you really care about. Like, it's got an agent on it, and I can get all this great data from it, or I don't. And so we're going to focus on not hot dog. So if you have a machine that's unmanaged, you have no agent, you have no way to really authenticate, do authentication to it because it's a vendor appliance, it's an IoT switch, it's some other doodad you don't have direct control over. It can be part of your OT, your ICS work. You need to be able to pull data from different sources to tell you about that asset anyways. So how do you get like a triangulated perspective about what that thing is? Like hardware model, firmware versions, anything you can possibly do to talk about it. The CAASM tools out there, they correlate data from multiple sources. Like you can do the same thing too. You can go through and dump your CrowdStrike inventory directly into whatever your Elastic or SIM of choice is, and then dump in your vuln scan data, then dump in something else. And then when you say, great, show me everything about this particular IP address, you've got at least something. You can at least say, well, this thing thought it was A and this thing thought it was B. I can at least work with that a little bit. That's actually a pretty reasonable approach still for where we are. So on the external attack surface management side, there's lots of great tools out there. Things that like scan your domain and find new assets that look like they belong to you, look for copyright footers in the pages, all kinds of cool EASM stuff. That's great. But the internal side's still really tough. trying to identify, do I have this printer? Do I have this PAX terminal? Do I have this particular device? Do I have a Huawei camera someplace? Do I have a Dahua someplace? Like all this other junk that's out there that you don't really have a direct line of sight through an agent or a managed scan. Vuln scanners are really good about telling you about vulnerabilities. What they're not really good about telling you about is asset information. They don't tell you what the hardware is. They don't tell you what the software is very well. They don't typically tell you what the exact OS version is. I can't tell you how many times I've gone and seen a vuln management report, and all you get is listed like, oh, this is a Linux device. I'm like, great, but is it a Roku streaming device? Is it a smart TV? Is it a switch? Is it a router? Is it a server? Like, you don't really get that distinction from vuln management. Instead, we get a list of vulnerabilities. So doing the internal side of this is probably the most difficult part of getting ahead of your environment. How do you just get a list of all the stuff running all your things? So if you have an EDR that gives you software inventory, that's great. You can dump the software inventory directly from the export side, either do an API or just do a manual export, throw that into your SIM, be able to quickly search for it and say, do I have it go anywhere? Do I have a move it? Do I have this particular technology installed anywhere, so that you have that handy when things hit the fan. The flip side, though, is you can then use the network for the rest of it. You can use your span port, you can put Zeek, you can get data from Zeek flows out of it, you can do anything else you can do for active scanning. You can throw Nmap at it, Zmap, mass scan, et cetera, commercial scanners, lots of great ones out there as well, and take all the data and throw that in the same place and then correlate it all together. So other kind of great tips for where to get data to make good decisions are your info and low vulnerabilities are actually the most valuable part of your vuln scanner. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into like a Nessus report, and the thing I really cared about for that assessment was all the things that were info level. Sometimes info level vulnerabilities are ones that are actually critical vulnerabilities that just weren't marked the right way. Like an example that I run into a lot is Zookeeper, of all the weirdest things. Anyone know what Zookeeper is? Okay, so there's a few folks who work with distributed computing stuff where Zookeeper is kind of like a HashiCorp vault daemon. It's basically like a secret server, like an etcd type thing. But typically Zookeeper, if you see it exposed in the network, it's full of passwords. It's full of all your credentials. It has your RSA signing keys. Like I ran across a telco the other day out of China that had like all their RSA signing keys, all their app keys, everything just sitting out there on the internet in the Zookeeper service. And I was curious, like, well, what do vuln management products do with this product? Well, one particular vendor reports Zookeeper as like, oh, you've got Zookeeper. It's info level vulnerability. I'm like, thanks, y'all. Like all my passwords hanging out in the wind, and you said it's info level. So don't discount the info level stuff. That tends to be actually where a lot of the meat stuff is. It's just, there's cases where the protocol of the application is less understood by the vuln management vendor. They don't really know a lot about it at the time, but if you're trying to quickly respond to every instance of that technology, you need to know about your Zookeepers really quickly. So that kind of applies across the board. Like you want to be able to get as much detailed information about your assets as possible. The challenge though is a lot of these products, what they really want to do is only tell you about the criticals and the highs, because getting all your infos and lows is actually a lot of data. Like you're pulling out gigs and gigs and gigs of data. One of our customers, when they do a Tenable export, it's something like 80 gigs of data. And they go back to us like, hey, it's taking a long time to get this data out. Like, yeah, we're waiting on Tenable to give us the data. That's just how it works. Like it's 80 gigs of raw data, and that's compressed. Like it decompresses like 230 gigs of like text. So it's a lot of data coming out of it, but it's really valuable once you have it, because you can do a quick rep on and say, great, find me everything running Zookeeper, find me every progress software install, find me every whatever it happens to be. STB ARP cache is a lot of fun too. If you can just dump the cache of the ARP cache of all your network devices or even your printers, they'll actually tell you they'll snitch on all their friends. They'll snitch about everything else on the network. You can get a list of like, do I have a Huawei device anywhere in my environment? Well, even if you don't see it directly, you can see it in the ARP cache of a neighboring switch and say, yeah, there's actually a Huawei box over there. I can see the MAC prefix over there. That ends up being a really useful technique as well. Another one of my favorite tricks is Google Workspace. It has this concept of endpoints. And you would think, oh, manage endpoints, et cetera, Chrome OS. No. Like anytime you log into a browser and log into Google, it creates an endpoint for that browser and that browser login. Anytime you install the Google Drive software, it actually does all kinds of cool stuff. It actually uploads your serial number from your machine, all kinds of information about your assets, almost like an MDM in that sense, just by installing the Google Drive software. So if you're running Google Workspace, go dump your endpoint data. You actually get a lot of really valuable stuff. You can say, are any of my employees running Google Drive on a machine that we don't support? Does this inventory and the serial numbers in my Google Drive export also match my CrowdStrike serial number inventory? Like, where do I have gaps in my inventory as a result? So that's been really helpful as well. Of course, DHCP, DNS, anything on the network side that gives you like a list of MACs and IPs that you can then cross-correlate and say, am I vuln scanning this? Is it part of any of my mitigation programs? Is it part of my security controls? And then there's some really like less obvious stuff that's hard to find and hard. You have to build your own tooling for it to get it out, or use the things we wrote. But these tend to be indicators of use. So there's a really cool feature, I guess, in SMB2 related to the session ID. So unlike SMB1, when you negotiate SMB2 or SMB3 session, you negotiate the session ID. It's like a 64-bit value. On Windows, and actually Windows, Samba, and even the SMBD on Mac OS, it's basically sequentially incremental. Mac OS used to leak the kernel base value as well from it, and there's a bunch of other related security vulnerabilities around this stuff. But the really interesting thing for me was that not only can you hijack other people's sessions on Windows and disconnect them, so you can break a file transfer just by guessing someone else's SMB2 session ID and then trying to basically hijack it. It'll cause you can't actually hijack it, but you can cause other systems to fail to finish whatever it's doing. But anyways, that's a bit of a tangent. The cool thing you can do about it, though, you can see whether anyone else talked to that SMB server since you talked to it last. You can get kind of a rough counter out of it. So if you're trying to scan the network and say, okay, do I have any Windows machines that are hanging out there that no one's actually logged into in some period of time? You can actually look at the SMB session ID from Nessus Scan 1, Nessus Scan 2. If the number hasn't changed very much, you know you've an idle box. It was changing a lot. This one's really logging into a lot. So same thing with the SMB counters. You can look at your switch port counter and say, has this asset been talking very frequently? Is it actually actively involved with the network traffic or not? And there's a thing called DCRP RPM, which has all kinds of great things you can dump out of it. The endpoint mapper has like a list of, does the machine have a Wi-Fi card installed? Does it run McAfee? Like you can get all kinds of cool stuff unauthenticated out of DCRP. So anyway, let's skip ahead because we're a little bit short on time here. But the short version is you want to take all this data, use it to build a detailed model of everything in your inventory, aggregate it all together based on IP, MAC, whatever you possibly can, host name. Don't worry about it too much. Just get it someplace. Get into a SIM of some sort. Get into Elastic. Get into a local database. Even just a big CSV file you can grab. Those are all great things. You want to track like what type of data is on the device, who's the owner of the device, what hardware is it running, what subnet's a part of, what host name is a part of. Like all really useful stuff for when things hit the fan. And then typically, if you are not currently in the middle of a crisis, you want to go shake out all the easy stuff. Go find all the things that are it's a managed asset, but it's not running one of your MDMs or EDRs. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, it's a machine that's on my domain, but doesn't have CrowdStrike installed. Let's go fix that. That's straightforward. You can also look for, do I have any assets anywhere in my estate that are not part of my vuln management scope? That is surprisingly common. And oftentimes when you're a brand new employee, you go into an organization, they say, hey, we want you to run a vuln management program. Here's a spreadsheet of our subnets. That's all you get. Like you have to either trust that or go find your own subnets, right? And if you just stick with what IT gives you, they're gonna be missing lots and lots and lots of stuff. And it's really common for your vuln management to be missing like 40% plus of your infrastructure. And that is not even an exaggeration. It's pretty common. Find all your end-of-life stuff. You still got XP out there somewhere. You got Windows 7. You got some, HMIs hanging out. Figure out where they are. Another great one is you can generally ask Windows machine what domain it's part of. And if it says it's not part of your main domain, we know it's unmanaged. So a really straight way to do that. Lastly, outliers. So finding the weird stuff. Like a really quick way to do this is just sort your list of things, whatever your things are, coming from CrowdStrike, from your vuln scanner, whatever it is, sort it based on OS or hardware or something else. And look at the bottom of that list. Look at the long tail of it. And typically the long tail will be indicative of risk as well. We've got the research report coming out in a couple of weeks here that talks about, we looked at 680,000 assets. We took in vuln management data from all the big vuln scanners. Then we also looked at how different those devices were from their peers within the same site. And we found there's a direct correlation from how weird it is to how risky it is. So typically the less of a thing you have or the more different a device looks like compared to its peers in the same network segment, the higher risk it has, and it's really predictive and a really strong correlation. So we'll talk more about that in a few weeks once we release a report, but we thought those were really interesting. So generally anything you see a one-off of or only a couple of in your environment, you typically want to go like pour gasoline on and burn it down, or at least put it off in its own little network and keep it separate. Those things tend to be unmanaged. They also tend to be really expensive and really valuable. So you only have so many AS400s, and they'll stick out like a sore thumb pretty quick if you look at your list of OSs. So the goal of all this is you want to be able to quickly respond to emerging threat. You want to say, hey, there's an actively exploited vulnerability in some product. I want to go find all the things that have that technology installed. That is the goal here. How quickly can you find all the things that are affected by some new emerging thing? The quicker you can answer that question, the less chance you're going to be affected by a breach. That's just it. So here's an example of looking for like Policy Secure, Connect Secure for the more recent Avanti Pulse Secure VPN endpoints. Secondly, okay, something did happen. Like you want to figure out what was the blast radius. So in this particular environment, what could they talk to? What's exposed? What's available? What's around? Like you need to know a lot about the environment to figure out what the blast radius was of a breach. And the more data you have beforehand, the better you are to respond. And that's pretty straightforward. It also makes it really easy to kind of manage your exposure in general. So the idea is you want to take whatever your favorite database or SIM of choice is, Elastic and FileBeat, Neo4j, Postgres, Splunk, you name it, shove all your data into it. It doesn't have to be particularly structured in a particular way. As long as you can correlate it and scan it or grep for it, that's great. Own it by your security teams. Your team should own managing this data, but give everyone else access to it. make sure the IT team, make sure your networking team, everyone else can go query this data, whatever they want to, and have them rely on that data for their own day-to-day stuff. Because that's going to give you a lot of ammo when it comes to maintaining it and getting information and help from them. So of course you can build your own thing, you can buy your own thing. Most products that you buy are really turnkey if you're small to medium sized. If you're a large organization, you're always gonna have some mix of buy and build. Like I can't tell you, like almost every major bank I've talked to, they've already got a massive internal version of this. They've already got their basically internal Shodan running. That's a conglomeration of a bunch of commercial products and internal stuff at open source that they mush all together to be able to do this exact process. So this is actually a really common model that's already in place today. And typically you're going to buy stuff and build stuff, and that's kind of how things are. So of course, doing all this is tricky. If you have ever set up an Elasticsearch cluster, the key thing to remember is it's going to fall over automatically in about 2 weeks. That's just guaranteed. So you got to make sure you have sharding in place and that you drop your indexes in a certain interval no matter what. Otherwise, it's just a time bomb for the next person to do it. So make sure you kind of structure all this stuff to be in the right, to have the right size for your scale. And of course, share your data. Monitor the ingestion, make sure you're actually pulling stuff in and it's not falling apart, give dashboards for the teams, and it's pretty easy to be the hero for exposure management in your org just by building this out with data you probably already have. Lots of cool stuff out there. You know, I work on a product that we've got a free version, of course, you can sign up for that. We've got like 30,000 people using it for their home labs at this point. It's a lot of fun. So that's runZero. You can also get similar things from a lot of your vulnerability management vendors these days that typically have something. And then on the open source side, there's lots of cool tools. So CISA actually has their own tool called Crossfeed, which basically takes data from like dozens and dozens of different sources and puts it all in one place, which is really cool. So I really like that CISA's been sponsoring that. Jupyter One is a commercial product for doing cloud security, semi-competitive with us, but they also have an open source tool called Starbase, which is like the way to take all the data from your environment and throw it into a Neo4j graphs database and search that. Ivray is really cool as well from Droids Corporation, and Axiom is also a really neat tool for kind of building your own attack surface management tooling around this stuff. So these are some pointers for it. If you ever want to build your own stuff and want to chat about it, please reach out. I love talking about this stuff, and I'll talk about it all day long. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and we want to have a couple minute or two for questions. Any question? Okay. Yeah, question was, what's your hot take on the XE backdoor? That's what I spent all of last weekend on, so it was a lot of fun. They got really close to owning almost every Linux distribution and even the Linux kernel. They were like days away from getting code into shipping into major distributions. We just got really, really, really lucky with it. Unfortunately, like it's not just like one little component that holds the entire stack. It's about 1,500 components hold the entire stack. And you know, as the Debian maintainer said, like you know, there's thousands of people out there who have no oversight who can put code into the distribution at any given point in time. That's just how the world works for open source. So I wish there was a better answer for it. That one was a particularly difficult one to scan for as well, given how it was implemented. There wasn't like a straight backdoor, network socket opener, things like that. Cool, awesome. Well, I'll get on the stage here. Thanks again. Have a good day.